This episode of In Defense of Ska is brought to you by Miami, Florida's Jacuzzi Fuzz. Jacuzzi Fuzz are a reggae rock ska band who played their first show in 2002. Since then, they have rounded out their lineup with keyboards and horns. They've been hard at work in the studio, and this song comes out on Friday, January 20th. It's called All It Took. All It Took is a song about sticking to your guns, not wavering from your vision, despite obstacles, doubts, and naysayers. Check it out on all streaming platforms and look for new music from Jacuzzi Fuzz this year. And now, on with the show.
In the second season of the hit CBS sitcom The Big Bang Theory, actor John Ross Bowie was cast to play the reoccurring nerd bully character Barry Kripke. A decade later, he was cast as one of the stars of the ABC sitcom Speechless. Before diving into acting, John was a punk rock kid. In the 80s, he attended punk, ska, and hardcore shows at CBGB's, the Ritz, and wherever else in New York he can get in. He later played bass in the 90s punk rock band Egghead. These years were very important to him and his development as a person, and influenced how he approached comedy, improv, and acting. In fact, he devotes a lot of space in his new memoir, No Job for a Man, talking about his punk years. Today, we chat with John about this time period, and no surprise, he knows quite a bit about ska.
John Ross Bowie, not Bowie, right?
Not Bowie, yeah.
I got it right, first time.
How did you know that his name was pronounced Bowie and not Bowie?
Because whenever we have to read a book for this podcast, you read it because you read fast and I read slow, so I listen to the audiobook. And so since I listened to the audiobook, I heard him say it.
Nice.
And I made a mental note.
Good thing, too, because he mentions in the book that people mispronouncing his name is a pet peeve of his.
Well, I mean, it's spelled exactly like Bowie, like David Bowie, but, you know, I can understand why people would make that mistake. But you know what they can't mistake?
What?
The fact that our guest today has ska roots.
Ska roots, punk roots, and the roots where those worlds collide.
Really some legit, like, hardcore punk roots.
Yeah.
You would not expect to see an actor from Big Bang Theory. Somebody who was a regular at CBGB's in kind of its heyday.
Yeah.
And John Ross Bowie was.
Yes, he was. And he played in a band too, Egghead.
Yeah. So if you have one of those Egghead 7 inches, get it signed. Why not? Ask John for his autograph.
While ska wasn't like necessarily his most favorite, genre, he liked the music and the stuff he knew very well. Like he was mentioning names of members of bands.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very impressed with his memory and his knowledge, even though it's not like necessarily his primary main genre.
I mean, that's fine. That's all we're looking for from people.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a super fan. You can just like it.
A couple years ago, or maybe it was a year ago, you posted a photo to your Instagram where you were on stage at CBGB's when the Toasters were playing. You remember this photo, or at least the experience itself?
I do remember this photo. I do very well remember this photo.
Well, I want to hear more about it.
It was from when I was in high school, and the Toasters had a monthly residency at CB's, and they were just such an incredibly reliably fun live act. This is right after Skaboom came out, so the Unity 2 were still in the group, and they're just a delight live. And I would go, and one time I brought my Minolta, and I got terrible shots of the band, but I hopped up on stage at one point to dance because the stage at CB's was maybe 10 inches, 11 inches high. It was really just right off the ground. So I hopped up and I took one shot the audience, and it's kind of great. It's perfectly exposed. Everyone's
Yeah.
in focus. I don't know who anybody is in there, but everyone's like sweaty, and they don't look like they're having fun. But it was such a packed, intense evening that I'm really glad I captured it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So okay, I'm from California, so I was not in New York in the 80s, but I've done a lot of research about it, and I know that ska and CBGBs overlapped. There was definitely a part of the ska scene in the late 80s that happened there.
Mm-hmm.
What I've heard is that the infamous hardcore matinees, everyone knows about the hardcore matinees,
Right.
that there was a period of time where there was ska matinees too.
Very brief period of time. They were Saturday afternoons. The hardcore matinees were Sunday, and for a brief period of time, the ska matinees were Saturday afternoons, and they were very sparsely attended. I went to a couple, and I was always kind of taken aback at how few people were there, given that the evening ska shows were just packed to the rafters. And I don't know if there just weren't enough bands, or the ska is just a real evening thing. Or if those fucking stoners couldn't get out of bed in time for a 3 p.m. show. I don't know. I can't point to why the market failed the ska matinee, but I would be surprised if that phenomenon lasted for 6 months. I don't recall specifically, but I think it was a very brief run.
Who besides the Toasters played those matinees that you remember?
It's funny. I don't actually remember the Toasters playing one of the matinees. I remember the Boilers playing one. I remember a band called Legal Gender who switched their name and got a little bit better, and they were called
The New York Citizens.
That's right, the New York Citizens, who have a great song called "Shut Up and Listen," which is sort of a mod ska hybrid thing, which is not streaming, but you can find it on YouTube. It's a banger. And I remember there was one terrible white reggae band called Red Stripe, named for the Jamaican beer. If they're listening, I apologize profusely, but they were not a good band. Holy shit! But yeah, they would do the matinees. I understood like why they would think that this would also work, but it just didn't. It just didn't work at all. So they discontinued them after a few months.
Saturday matinee seems like a better time slot too than a Sunday.
Oh, on every front, it should have worked.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, like, on paper, this makes perfect sense. Let's remake The Day the Earth Stood Still, but with better special effects. On paper, okay, why not? It just doesn't pan out, Sure. It's the goddamnedest thing. But it was a really fun, vibrant scene in the late 80s, and it was. They were definitely safer than the hardcore shows for obvious reasons. There was just a general more inclusive and chill vibe across the board. It was, and there were just so many great bands. The Toasters were a real highlight, but the Boilers had a brief run, but they were fantastic. They turned into Skinnerbox, who were good, but the Boilers had something really, really special. They were really, really good. And there was a band called The Second Step.
Yeah, Second Step, yeah.
Who kind of, they started to go a little more pop, and I think they were trying to get signed to a major, and it kind of fell apart. They were, when they were good though, they were really good.
Do you remember, so it was Jeff Baker was in Boilers, then Skinnerbox, but then...
Right, he was the singer, right?
Yes, he was singer and trombonist.
Right, and then there was that guy Oliver who was just the Boilers, and I think when Oliver left, they became Skinnerbox, and it was kind of there was some weird politics that I wasn't privy to, but like some shit had gone down apparently, and Oliver was no longer welcome in the group or whatever, and this was just a vibe I got, by the way. I have no data to back this up. This is not libel, but I remember going to see the Boilers and like, hi, we're Skinnerbox now, and I was like, oh. I liked Oliver's voice a lot. I really did.
But then during Skinnerbox, Jeff started the Stubborn All-Stars as a side project. But I always liked Stubborn All-Stars. I thought Stubborn All-Stars was the best. Did you ever hear that band?
I feel like at this point I have gone off to college, and
Okay.
I am in upstate New York, and I am not catching. I'm not in the scene as much. Uh, so yeah, my prime CB going years were 87 to 89.
Okay.
A great time to be going there. Great time to be going there. But those were my prime CB's years. And then I would go to like some larger shows at like Irving Plaza, or when they moved the Ritz up to 54th Street in the Studio 54 space, they did some like Super Bowl of ska shows that were fun to go to as well.
You mentioned that you saw the Toasters in the Unity 2 era.
Yeah.
Can you explain Unity 2 to people? Because this is a very brief period of time for Toasters, but I think a highlight of their career.
The Unity 2 were these two toasters named Sean and Lionel.
Yeah.
Man, that was a pull.
You got it, though. You landed.
I that was filed away in the back of my head. I think I have a nosebleed now. That was
Stuck the landing.
wow. Sean and Lionel were sort of the hype men, backup singers in the Toasters, and they had a couple showcase numbers. And they were incredibly fun to watch. Because Rob Hingley was the singer?
Yeah.
Rob Hingley was a singer and a guitarist and a great songwriter, but as a singer and a guitarist, he was sort of stationary in front of the mic and couldn't go too many places. And what made them such a fun live act is they had these two other guys who would dash all over the place, and they were hype men. They were hype men, and Sean could sing a little bit, and Lionel could sing really well, and he was a great toaster. I believe he was actually from Haiti. And they were a delight. And then they broke off and went solo and put out a record on a major, unless I'm mistaken.
It is, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, called The Unity 2, which had a couple of really fun songs. There was a song called Shirley, which was the single, which was kind of a fun, like an old school Jamaican ska number. Like it was a little slower. It was a little closer to Desmond Decker than like the really fast shit that was going on in New York at the time. They were a really fun hip hop ska hybrid, and I'm kind of surprised. I remember we played the shit out of them when the record came into my college radio station. And I was like, "These guys are great. We are going to play these guys," and I pushed them, and everybody got on board. We gave them a modest regional hit in Ithaca, New York, for what it's worth.
They're huge in Ithaca.
They were huge in Ithaca for a brief period of time there, but it was they were really they were fun, and I gotta say, I think the sum was greater than its parts, because the Toasters lost a little something when they took off, and I don't know that the Unity 2 had much of a career after they broke off. They put out like one or two albums.
That record did not do well.
Yeah, and it was a shame too, because I don't know. I understand why people would be like, "Hey, I want to go off on my own. We have a lot to offer here." But at the end of the day, the Toasters with Unity 2 were just a delight. I mean, I went once a month for like a year, and they were just always reliable and so fun, and an absolute delight to watch and listen to.
Yeah, it was. The story goes is that there was like major label people scoping Toasters, or at least that's what they thought. And then they said, "Hey, no, we really want Unity 2."
Oh, wow.
But they kind of were thinking about going on their own anyways. So they're like, yes.
Interesting.
Let's do this. Yeah. I thought it was good too. I like them because it's like kind of had that reggae, like rocksteady toasting thing, but also sort of had that New York hip hop thing too.
Oh, definitely. And like really fun outer borough Queens hip hop.
Yeah,
too.
Exactly.
It was really they were just a really good party band. I'm trying to remember the other. We went 2 singles into that record. I am trying to. It was called "What Is It Yo." It was the title track.
Yeah.
The title track was "What Is It Yo," and it was really fun. And it was a real get everybody on the dance floor thing for a couple of months in Ithaca, New York.
I know you're not a big fan of hardcore, but you did.
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I it has a place in my heart. I don't. For years, I went to a lot of those shows because that was what the matinees were, and it was easy to go to a matinee, and it didn't involve any bargaining with my parents because I'd be home by 8 p.m. So it was not a big deal, and I loved live music. And the energy at those shows were really fun. It was not my Let me put it this way. There was a lot of punk bands I would see, and I would think, gosh, I would love to be in that band. I've really never seen a hardcore band where I've been like, oh, I'd love to be in that. I'd love to be up there with Underdog. Oh, somebody should put me in Raw Deal. How come I'm not in the Cro-Mags? Like, I never had that sense of like, I want to get up there and do that, like I had with other bands. That's the best way to put it, I think. I enjoyed but had no interest in emulating.
Cro-Mags featuring John Ross Bowie. I think that would
Hello. Hi, guys. Hi, fellas.
Hey, fellas.
Cool if I keep my shirt on? I'd like to keep my shirt on. It's all I'm saying to everybody else. I do have tattoos, actually. They're my kids' Hebrew names.
Even though you were a straight edge kid, the hardcore wasn't like really.
It was, I like a hook,
Sure.
I really like a hook. I loved some of the guitar work on those records. Probably my favorite of the New York hardcore bands was Gorilla Biscuits, because they were definitely the hookiest.
Yeah.
And Walter's career post Gorilla Biscuits has borne that out. And they also had the closest thing to a sense of humor that you could possibly, which is not saying a whole lot. The bar is pretty fucking low in that scene, but they would cover the Buzzcocks, at least, they had some sense of irony that was sorely lacking in the other bands of that time.
In your delightful book, No Job for a Man, you briefly mention a genre called Krishnacore.
Yeah.
People need to know about Krishnacore.
Yeah, let's expand on that a little bit right now.
I will do everything I can. As I say in the book, it is the weirdest musical subgenre I've ever seen up close. But what happened was a bunch of the New York hardcore kids, and these were kids who were, they were kind of disenfranchised working class kids from deep Queens or the shittier parts of Connecticut. They weren't necessarily like of the artsy scene that brought us television or the Shirts or Blondie. Like this was about 7 to 8 years after that wave of CB's bands. And you had all these guys who had already seen a bunch of people get taken out by heroin and booze and heroin and mostly heroin, and decided they were going to adopt like the DC strain of straight edge. So the straight edge scene moved up to New York and became very big. And then when straight edge wasn't enough, they were all looking for some sort of extra spiritual fulfillment. And they all had their heads shaved anyway. And the Lower East Side always had a bunch of Krishna temples. And Hare Krishna is similar to the Jehovah's Witnesses or a lot of evangelical Christian faiths. It's based in Hinduism, but they recruit. They go out and they recruit. And you would get flyered, and you would have people, try to sell you books. I was approached by Krishnas all the time. If you wandered around downtown, they were looking for people. And the straight edge vegan bald kids were like, it's really just a couple extra steps to go into Hare Krishna at this point. And they did. And you had a bunch of bands like Youth of Today became Shelter. And a lot of these bands became hardcore, devout Hare Krishnas, and that's what they would sing about. So you would look at, you'd pick up the first Cro-Mags album, and it has a mushroom cloud on the cover, and then you go 2 albums later, and there's a blue god on the cover, and you're like, all right, something's happened here. There's been some sort of shift, and that was Krishnacore. It was a very odd religious offshoot of straight edge hardcore in New York.
Did you have any friends that fell in with that?
A couple, not close ones. I'm actually in over the past year, I've become friends with Brooke Smith, the actress who was a big attendee at those shows, at the Sunday matinee shows. And she's a couple years older than me, and she was friends with the Cro-Mags, and she used to drive them places. She got involved with it a little bit. I didn't know her when she was involved with it. And I didn't have anyone super close, but I was constantly being invited you got to check out the vegetarian lunch, man. You got to come by and try the vegetarian lunch. I was like, yeah, it just it's homework, I'm just swamped. I'm swamped over here, guys. But it was a fascinating era. There's got to be a book or a documentary about it somewhere.
Oh, sure.
I saw something on YouTube. It was just like a 10-minute documentary made in the time. I watched like a few minutes of it, and there's this kid who's in one of these bands talking, and I couldn't deal with it. He just sounded too just like wide-eyed.
Yeah.
Like he's got the world figured out, and it makes no sense. I was like, I can't watch this.
No, I think it was. I think it got a little culty for some of those guys, and
definitely.
you do you. Everyone follow your bliss, guys. But it wasn't my jam.
So you did the Ritz was a place you went to a lot for shows.
Yeah, I saw some good, not just punk shows and ska shows. I saw a bunch of great bands at the Ritz. I saw Chuck Berry at the Ritz.
Mm-hmm.
I saw oh God, I saw the Cramps there. I saw did I see the Pogues there? I might have seen the Pogues there one year, which was really fun. But it was the Ritz was great. Old ballroom, great acoustics. Saw a couple of amazing, breathtaking Fishbone shows there, which were always incredibly fun.
Late 80s Fishbone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Between oh God, what's their second album? Is that The Reality of My Surroundings?
See the self-titled EP, then it's In Your Face, then Truth.
Oh, sorry, between In Your Face and Truth and Soul.
Yeah.
That's when I saw them. That's the first time I saw them. And then I saw them on Truth and Soul. And then Reality of My Surroundings is the one that had the hits, right? That's the one that put them on what's on the Saturday and Everyday Sunshine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That I saw them a bunch on that tour too. The thing about Fishbone that was so cool is that you could put them on any bill you wanted and it sort of made sense,
Right.
Like they were so all things to everyone that like I saw them on bills with hip hop groups. I saw them with hardcore groups. But no one ever went after Fishbone. Like you did not follow Fishbone at the time. Like you were it was a sucker's gig to go on after Fishbone.
Sure.
You were only going to disappoint. So I remember seeing a bill at the Palladium on 14th Street, which is now an NYU dorm, but it was a crazy fucking bill that was, this is summer 1990, let's say, in ascending order, Dead Milkmen, the Dirty Dozen Brass Band from New Orleans, Two Live Crew, fresh out of jail, and Fishbone.
Damn.
Right. Yeah, it was a fucking crazy evening.
Yeah.
It was eclectic to a fault, but I had a great time. I enjoyed myself all the way through.
Chris Dowd, the keyboardist, he told me that when Truth and Soul was coming out, that they really wanted to do a big show with NWA and that they just couldn't make it work with management.
That's a shame.
That would have been something. Truth and Soul era, Fishbone with 1988 NWA.
Yeah. Coming, that would have been Fuck the Police era. Yeah, that would have been really incredible. That would have been really fucking strong. What a loss. Yeah, it was. That was a great era. Fishbone are doing punk rock bowling this spring, and I'm going. They are sort of in the middle of the day or later in the day, I think. But I still pity the band that goes on after them, man.
Sure.
I have a very specific ska story.
Yes, I want your specific ska story.
I thought you might.
This is the place for it.
Yeah, so the last time I was a series regular was a show called Speechless a couple of years ago. And it ran for 3 seasons and had a small but devoted following. And it was a really fun set because it was very, very collaborative. And I was not a writer or a producer, but I was allowed input. And it was a real, if there was a problem or someone had wanted to like beef up a joke or something, we were all hands on deck. A good idea could come from anywhere. So I felt very comfortable pitching ideas. And we had a running gag on the show where my wife, who was played by Minnie Driver, had all these things she hated. And there was a wall in the dining room called the Dead to Maya wall. And on that wall was a list of all the things she couldn't stand. And it was just a place for people to put up random jokes. Of things to be annoyed at, saying "you think" in response to anything, sandwiches with too much mayonnaise. There was all this random shit up there of things that got on my wife's nerves, and the joke was that the wall was just covered in things that pissed off my wife. And one of the things, when we first revealed the wall, one of the things that was on there was ska, and there was a line about it. And Minnie, who knows a great deal about music, and we had great talks about music. She's like, I can't do this. I can't do this line. I was like, what's going on? Because I'm in my late 40s and I'm British. We all love ska. And I'm like, yeah, I guess you do, don't you? Yeah, that's ridiculous. You all grew up with Selector and Specials, and you were in that fucking great second wave of British. Yeah, no, we do have a problem here. And the crew, of course, is like, yes, by all means, let's miss lunch over this, So everyone's starting to get like annoyed, but at the same time, I'm like, we can't ignore. If she says she hates ska, we have to do a whole other half a page on why this is the one middle-aged British woman who hates ska. Like, we're fucked. Like, this is a real, like, and our showrunner comes down from the writer's room and he's like, what's going on? And I listen, I know how this sounds, but Minnie's got a case here, man. Or people her age from the UK fucking love ska. This won't stand. And he's like, it's already written on the wall. And I was like, I know. And we're just standing there. And I was like, okay, compromise. 90s ska. And everyone's like, oh, I'm like, yeah, she would not like the kind of, I don't mind that stuff, but she would not be into the more watered down Southern California type stuff that, like the Boss Tones and their lesser imitators. That would not be her bag. So I think we could say 90s ska and cover our bets. And Minnie's like, I'm fine with that. And I'm like, great. Okay, so what's the new joke? And somebody pitches, Cedric, who was one of my co-stars, says, what's your problem? What did 90s ska ever do to you? And Minnie goes, ruin the 90s. And I was like, great. Everybody's happy. We're good. We can do this. Let's shoot. Let's fucking roll. Let's go to lunch. And it was arguably my greatest contribution to the writing of that show.
Now, wasn't there an episode where she unbans everything on that list?
There was, actually, yeah. And our composer wrote a song for it. I start to do everything. Like I take baths in the middle of the day. I have a sandwich covered in mayonnaise. I roller skate in the house. And they accompanied it with a song that was an original song that was absolutely not the impression that I get. I don't know what would make you think it was the impression that I get, because it was not the impression that I get. It had different chords, but it was certainly not the impression that I get under any circumstances. And in no legal way was this song that they used as a background for that montage the impression that I get.
Right.
So that's how that went down.
So you interviewed the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones when you were a college radio DJ in Ithaca.
Oh my God, yes, I did.
Let's hear about
that. I interviewed Joe.
Joe Gittleman, okay.
Joe Gittleman on the bass, yes.
And this was early 90s?
This would have been someday, I suppose, or maybe right before that.
Okay.
Yeah, they would play Ithaca all the time. They were big in Ithaca. We played the shit out of them on our college radio station, and they would always pack the clubs there. And they probably went on to play the larger venues after I graduated, but they were huge in upstate New York.
And you got into the show for free.
I did, yeah. It was pretty cool. I got to see a lot of shows for free in college because I was on the radio station. It was pretty awesome. It was pretty fucking sweet. And let it be said also that Joe was incredibly polite and patient with me, and I was not a very good interviewer. I just didn't have the chops yet. I still get kind of starstruck around musicians more so than I get around actors. There is still something about like, you're a fucking rock star, dude. No matter how small a venue I've seen them play, they've still kind of done something a little extra. And I've worked with impressive fucking actors, but I'll get so much more in front of, the bassist from the Boss Tones than I will in front of Diane Keaton. It's really weird. I'm still a huge fanboy.
So like what kind of bad questions did you ask? Like, where did you guys get your name from?
Oh, best question.
It wouldn't have been that. It wouldn't have been that bad. I had figured that out myself. Thank you. I think I think it was, like the really sort of generic, what are your influences?
Yeah.
And to their credit, again, super fucking patient with me. I remember asking them, because merging like punk, or at the very least hard rock with ska, was something of a novelty. You know, it was not something that was being done a ton. Even, I mean, you could say, well, the Clash was doing it, but not quite. The Clash would have their reggae and ska songs, and then they'd have their punk songs. But to do ska that fast was a novelty. And I remember talking to them a little bit about that, and they had just covered Enter Sandman as a B-side. And I talked a little bit to them about, you know, why they were into Metallica and stuff like that. So, but I just remember there was just a lot of dead air because I was fumbling for questions and super nervous. And how do they like playing? How have the crowds been? What is your favorite thing about? Do your suits get uncomfortable? You know, is that kind of thing. I was, you know, whatever, 20 years old, incredibly nervous, and they were endlessly patient. Another notable ska band that came through town that didn't record much, but do you remember Bigger Thomas from New Jersey?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. I'm friends with Mark. Yeah.
Okay, so Bigger Thomas came through town, and I was an English major, and I was super proud that I got their reference. I got the reference Bigger Thomas from Richard Wright's native son. I'm super proud of myself for that. So most of the interview was about that.
Do you remember who in the band you interviewed?
The singer and I want to say the bassist.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's Mark.
The singer was a really charming guy.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name.
Robert.
Okay, their bassist was this kind of, he was a big oaf, big Jersey oaf white guy, but he was super sweet too.
Yeah.
They were both really nice and incredibly patient with me. Again, those guys would do the college radio circuit, and God only knows what kind of dipshits they had to be interviewed by. So they were not new to that kind of embarrassment.
Yeah.
So in your book, like the reference that like jumped out at me the most, that kind of surprised me to see in the book, was you talked about the band One Eye Open.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I've seen them before.
We played with them, Aaron. When we were in a band together, we opened for them.
Great band, kind of unhinged and kind of insane, but in the best way possible.
Well, they lived in that van.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the thing. It's like they lived in that van. They were the real fucking deal. And they're in the book because A, they were a powder keg live. And B, they were making commitments that my band, Egghead, were not willing to make. We just were not, like, we were relying on our day jobs, and we had girlfriends, and in one case, a wife back home. And we were like, yeah, we can't fully commit to this living out of a van, calling ahead for the next gig, super duper punk rock thing. But, you know, if you watch the two of us play live, you could pretty much tell which one was rehearsing more. And it was absolutely One Eye Open.
There's no rehearsal, like nonstop tour. Yeah.
Good for them. I'm so glad I shouted them out. You are the first person to ask me about them.
Wow.
I'll tell you a funny story about them. So in the mid-90s, they released a split record with this band called the Janitors Against Apartheid.
I remember that. Yeah.
It's called Nerds, right?
Right.
In pure 90s fashion, it's a parody of the Nerds candy for the art. Everybody did that in the 90s with their shirts or with their whatever. And they got a lawsuit, or janitors did. Janitors got hit with lawsuit. Lawyers came, all kinds of trouble. And I've talked to that band. They've told me all about it. And the funny detail they told me was that it's like they said they never could track down One Eye Open because those guys just used fake names in their album. And the lawyers had no idea where to find this band. So they gave up.
I would never in a million years know where to track those guys down. They were nomads. They had, they absolutely were basically off the grid.
So it worked out in their favor.
It totally worked out. Which band were you guys in?
I was in a band called Flat Planet.
Yeah, and then I was in that band for a brief period of time, and then I joined a band called Link 80.
Oh, Link 80 sound familiar.
Yeah.
Link 80 was much bigger than Flat Planet.
Okay, all right.
Flat Planet, yeah.
One of the One Eye Open guys has a screen printing shop in LA now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Kinky Control, both with K's.
Oh, all right. Okay.
And swing by.
Yes, just swing by.
Yeah, I absolutely will. Next time I need screening done, I will absolutely do that. That's so cool. Yeah, they were God, well, that would have been Charleston, West Virginia. We played a coffee house with them, and they were really sweet to us.
So your band Egghead, okay, you started
Yeah.
in what, like 92?
The Egghead that recorded started in 94.
Okay.
There was an earlier draft in college, but the Egghead that recorded and toured was 94 to 98. Yeah.
Pop punk, basically.
Garagey pop
Yeah.
punk. Yeah. People hear pop punk and they think they expect a sort of a slicker Blink-182 Newfound
Sure.
Glory
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
That wasn't, that I don't have anything against that stuff, but we were a little closer to, and we were also listening to like a lot of hick punk, a lot of like 9 Pound Hammer and Super Suckers, and a lot of Kinks. So we were a little more garagey than what was put under the narrow confines of pop punk at the time. But that is this. I mean, the stuff I grew up listening to was Ramones and Dickies and Toy Dolls, and that really funny, goofy punk rock is still near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, so your introduction to punk rock is as a kid, right? You were at camp. Counselors were doing like a dance routine to.
They did a dance routine to Rockaway Beach. Yeah, that was the first time I heard that music, and it really stuck with me. But then it was years later that I decided, like, oh yeah, those guys, the Rockaway Beach guys, I should buy a record. And I didn't buy that record. I bought the first one because I thought the title "Now I Want to Sniff Some Glue" was the funniest thing I'd ever heard, and I still do. And so I bought that record, and the rest is trivia. Yeah, changed my life.
Your impression in the audiobook of the Ramones talking about wanting to sniff glue is pretty great.
Oh, thank you. That was a fun. It's funny. There's some bits that work better on the page, like written down,
Yeah.
and there were some bits that work better in the audiobook, and that's one of them. There's a whole chunk in there where what I love about that song title is the now at the beginning of it. Because there's tons of I wanna and I don't wanna in the Ramones canon, but it's the now, the immediacy of now, and that sense of like he's just checking off a bunch of errands he's got to run today. Like, okay, well, I ran to the grocery store, I got some milk, I should swing by and get a paper. I should get a couple light bulbs at the hardware store. What do you want to do now, Joey? Oh, now I want to sniff some glue. And I just, that sense of like, just one more thing I got to get done today. Mondays, am I right? I love that. It kills me. It's so goddamn funny.
Adam listened to your audiobook. I read your book. I don't know what that says about us, but I just think that needs to be put out there.
It says that I read a lot slower than you do.
That's absolutely fine. I have gotten more into audiobooks of late myself. There's no shame in that. I'm very proud of the work that went into the audiobook. I'm glad I was able to accompany you on your errands while you were running out to sniff some glue or whatever it was you had to do.
Yeah, lots of folding laundry and lots of doing dishes.
Phenomenal. Great. Anything I can do to help that. That was the first time I'd ever done an audiobook. Was my own, and it's a steep learning curve. It's a very specific skill, but I'm really glad to hear you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great.
How long did it take you to do it, to the recording?
4 days of 5-hour sessions.
All right,
it's not too bad.
No, about 20 hours to record about 7.5 hours. Not too bad. No, but I finished the first like chapter and a half, and the director kept stopping me and sort of nudging me in a certain direction. I was like, I don't know how to give this woman what she wants. This is really frustrating. And then I got into a groove where it was, the difference between talking to someone and talking at someone, and I got to the talking to place, and the director said, you know what I think we should do? And I said, we should go back and start over, shouldn't we? And she goes, yes, I'm so glad you agree. And so we ditched like an hour of audio, just trashed all of it, and I started over, and that's the version you hear, because it really took me a while to get the hang of that audiobook voice. There's a way of like you're acting, you're trying to bring them in, but you're also reading, and it was a weird challenge. I'm getting all like boring inside the actor's studio stuff here.
No, this is very interesting to me. I'm going to be recording an audiobook in a few months. So.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Listen to a bunch of audiobooks and figure out what works for you, what you like, figure out what you like listening to. Is it a book that you wrote?
Yeah, I wrote a book called In Defense of Ska.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. A, I look forward to it. And B, listen to like a lot of other music audiobooks and see what works for you.
Now, this is probably not the case for you, but for me, I'll give you my story. They bought the rights to the book and they said, we'll get somebody, we'll hire somebody. And I said, I want to read it. They're like, okay, well, you have to audition. I was like, okay, I'll audition, but I want to read it. I don't.
Yeah, sure.
So I had to send them like a 5-minute tape of me reading in order for them to approve that I was the person to read my own book.
No, yeah, that happens. You hear those stories a lot. You absolutely hear those stories a lot. I did a cartoon pilot a few years ago that I wrote, and I wrote a role for myself, and I had to audition for it.
Amazing.
And it still didn't go to series, so I don't know who won really, but people audition for their own shit. It happens more than it should.
John, have you ever listened to the Henry Rollins Get in the Van audiobook?
Believe it or not, I have not. I hear it's great. You know what I loved is the 2 John Doe books that aren't really John Doe books. The ones, is it Under the Blue Black Sun? He wrote 2 books that are histories of the early LA punk scene, but they're essentially, he edited 2 oral histories.
Okay.
And so he got, Jack Grisham from TSOL and Jane Weedlin and DJ Bonebreak and all these people got together and wrote a chapter on their version of the LA punk scene. And then they all read their individual chapters, and it's a great listen.
Amazing.
Cannot recommend them enough. But I will pick up Get in the Van. I can't believe I haven't listened to that yet.
Also, before we get off that topic, the American Hardcore documentary, have you seen that?
It's good. I like it.
Yeah.
I feel like each one of those scenes deserves its own movie.
Sure.
It actually feels a little rushed to me.
Yeah. What about the narration by Tim Armstrong?
Fine. Wouldn't necessarily have been my choice, but fine. He's interesting to listen to.
If for nothing else, the story of him talking about, I think it's Youth of Today coming to play at Gilman and him taking him to the donut shop and them explaining that they're vegan and straight edge. Just that snippet is so funny and good.
Yeah, you need to go back and watch that. You're right. I do need to go back and watch that. That's an interesting field. You know what I'm saying though about that movie being actually a little on the short side. Like you really could. There's a moment where they're interviewing HR in front of the Mulholland Fountain here in LA, and he's talking about like the mistakes he made in his youth. And I'm like, well, no, there's a whole movie. Let's do that. And there is an HR movie.
Yeah, let's unpack that whole thing.
Yeah, but I mean that's a whole situation there.
Yeah.
I recommend actually, because the guy who made that movie also wrote a book, like simultaneously. I think he must have used, the same interviews for the movie as he did for the book.
Yeah.
Have you read the book's really in detail? And
the book's great.
Yeah, and it's like every city, and it really kind of was enlightening to me to see how back in the 80s, how different a scene could be based off of city.
Sure.
And some of those scenes were like awesome. Some of them sounded completely insane.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the way they would get taken over by the right wing sort of like element of hardcore.
When Orange County invaded Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole thing is really, really interesting. Yeah, that book is great. The sad thing about that book is it says, so the scene's pretty much dead by 1986. And I start going to CB's at 87 when I turn 16. I'm like, man, fucking don't yuck my yum. Fuck you.
Dude, that's like me with the East Bay documentary.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I started going to shows like right as the documentary ends. Like that's when I started coming to shows up here.
Yeah, that's frustrating. It's always frustrating when some gatekeeper tells you the bands you saw were not relevant. Yeah, that sucks.
Wait, just backing up a little bit. I just want to ask about a couple other venues in New York really quick before we move on. Did you ever go to Coney Island High?
Oh, we played Coney Island High.
Yeah, upstairs or downstairs?
Both.
What do you remember about Coney Island High?
What I remember about Coney Island High is that we got on great bills. We opened for the Dickies. We opened for Sicko. We opened, I think, for the Figs. We got on great bills at Coney Island High. And it's funny, I had heard at the time that they got closed for not checking IDs and for serving underage people. But I heard it was just a rent thing. They just, weren't making the rent, but they were it was a great venue. I loved playing that place. I loved seeing bands there, and I loved playing that place. We did some great fucking shows at Coney Island High. It was great.
For the listener, visually, can you describe what it looked like?
I can really only compare it to other clubs. Well, for one thing, it was nowhere near Coney Island. It was on St. Mark's Place in Manhattan. It was there was a larger venue on the ground floor, literally the ground floor. You walked straight in, and then there was sort of an upstairs lounge. Larger venue was probably, I don't know, 200, 250 people. Upstairs, maybe closer to 100. It was the right combination of wide and long, so there were really no bad sight lines. Like there were some places where if you were all the way in the back at CB's, you were at the end of a really long hallway, and the sound was good, but you couldn't really see much. And God forbid you were only 5'8", like I am. You could really miss out on shit. But the way it was laid out, Coney Island High, you could get a good vantage point from anywhere. It was wonderful. And it was just there was a fun scene there. It was just you would see Marky Ramone hanging out sometimes, and Joey would walk by all the time because he lived around the corner. Marky Ramone and the Intruders played there a bunch, and as I said, Egghead was the one time we got on really good bills with like-minded bands was Coney Island High, and then occasionally around the corner at the Continental, neither of which are there anymore.
What about Wetlands?
Oh, Wetlands. Wetlands was fun too. Yeah, Wetlands was all the way over it barely qualifies as Tribeca, but I guess you would call it Tribeca. All the way on the west side of Manhattan. Tribeca, for being the triangle beneath Canal. It wasn't quite in the triangle beneath Canal. There's a set bunch of streets that make that triangle. It was further over, really close to the West Coast Highway, but West Side Highway. But it was a really long venue with a stage on one side, and you would see, who I saw there a bunch was Bop Harvey. Remember Bop Harvey from New England? I feel like they were from Rhode Island.
No, they're from Michigan. Ann Arbor.
No.
Yeah.
They were?
Yep.
They were from Ann Arbor?
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds right. Now that you mention it, you're right. They were from Ann Arbor. I might have them confused with is who they played with this funk band called Chucklehead. And I feel like Chucklehead might have been from New England. Man, I'm wrong about them too. Time. She's undefeated.
Man, why did funk never take off?
But yeah, it was they were Wetlands was really fun. Wetlands had a really eclectic booking style. Like you could go see the Queers, and then the Queers would clear out, and like the next show they'd clear out the house, and then later that night, like the Aquarium Rescue Unit would come on. They were huge for jam bands. A lot of jam bands cut their teeth at the Wetlands. So if you were like a Fish fan in 1988, you could probably see Fish at Wetlands, or Blues Traveler, or Spin Doctors, or any of those guys from that Northeast corridor of jam bands.
Spin Doctors. What about Brownies?
Brownies was small and cramped, and I did not like the guy who booked there, and he didn't like me, Mike something. But what sucked about him not liking me is the guy had impeccable taste. He would like book so many good bands, and I'd be like, oh, I guess he doesn't think we're as good as these guys. But I never saw any ska there. But because it was a very small venue, and I feel like more than 4 or 5 people on that stage, and you're cramped. You're really, really cramped, and so it out of necessity sort of prohibited a horn section. But do you remember the Upper Crust?
Do you, Aaron?
No, I don't know that.
They were a hard rock band that dressed as 18th century fops, powdered wigs, single black mole on their cheeks, ruffled collars. And they had an album called Let Them Eat Rock, and that was their shtick. That was all of their fucking shtick, was that they were 18th century aristocrats who played AC/DC type shred rock, and they would get up there, who is this Brownie? These conditions are deplorable. They were so committed to their shtick. They were magnificent. And like Egghead had really good shtick. But these guys had really good shtick and chops for days. And it was just like, God damn it. Why are you guys so fucking good? And they were not for everybody by any stretch. You know, you really had to like have a fondness for 70s arena rock and restoration comedy. And it just so happens I'm in that Venn diagram. But so they never played the big rooms, but God, were they fun.
So in your book, you touch on some of the culture of punk. And when I say punk, I mean the punk scene. So that includes, punk, hardcore, ska, this larger sort of DIY punk scene that we're all kind of talking about.
Sure.
Not specifically the music, but you kind of talk about the culture of punk in a way, in ways that are very, very specific and very, very on the nose. And you talk about its impact on your life. So some of the stuff I like. So you briefly talk about the fear of being a poser when you're part of the scene.
Yeah, yeah.
You talk about that a little bit?
Well, it was a punk once you got in and once people got to know you could be pretty inclusive. But it was that first step of getting in and people getting to know you that was a big jump, and there was, and I imagine this is more of an issue now, that you can, buy a cramp shirt at H&M, but at the time, the gatekeeping was very intense. And there was a sense of like, look, some of us get beaten up for having orange mohawks. So if you're not willing to fucking walk the walk, then you're not really with us. And I understood that, but I also just didn't feel like doing anything particularly crazy to my hair. I just wanted to like get up front and pogo. So there was a sense of gatekeeping and, you must be this cool to ride this particular ride. But once you made it clear that you really loved this music by, getting up front and having, Brian Baker clock you in the head with his guitar during a Dag Nasty set, once you prove that, people were usually pretty inclusive and friendly. And as I've grown older, it's only gotten friendlier. I went to punk rock bowling last September, and it was like a high school reunion for a high school I didn't actually go to. It was lovely. And, some of that comes from, this guy's on TV and he likes punk rock. And I recognize that. But there was just a lot of people who also have no idea who I am, who are like, oh, man, where'd you get that shirt? I'm like, oh, I will happily tell you where I got the shirt. Where'd you get that shirt? And so it's always going to be a fun place for angry misfits with a sense of humor. And that is still how I identify.
You also talk about in the book how punk is self-critical, and that's kind of an anomaly, I think, in music scene.
That's an anomaly across music, I think. Yeah, it's the I cite a couple of bands that that had songs that questioned some of the dumber aspects of punk rock.
Mm-hmm.
Makes No Sense at All by Husker Du being a terrific example. Where Do You Draw the Line by Dead Kennedys, which has a great line. What was great about the Kennedys is that they questioned everybody. Nobody was immune to their criticism. So, like, they would come after, a genuine liberal like Jerry Brown because there was still a lot of bullshit in his platform, and they would question their fellow punks. And there's a line from that song, which is on Bedtime for Democracy, their last record, and the line goes, anarchy sounds good to me. Then someone asks, who'd fix the sewers? And I remember being 16 and being like, oh, yeah, no, who's going to volunteer for that? Yeah, that sucks. That's interesting. What would we do? And I just found it interesting that punk was the only genre that would turn the lens upon itself a little bit and question each other. And you find this in Minor Threat songs. You'll find this in Fugazi songs. People got very critical of the drug scene as that became more prevalent. It was a very self-aware genre, and there aren't too many of those.
Yeah, because I think like self-aware genre, self-critical lyrics leads to self-critical thinking.
Yeah,
I think that's the thought behind it, and I think there's validity to that.
Yeah, I think that's what makes punk endurable.
Yeah,
is its tendency within those 4 or 5 chords to reinvent and question a little bit.
In the book, like one of the ongoing things you discuss here and there is sort of racism, sort of racism within your family, your own personal biases that you're kind of working with and working through and making progress as you get older. I don't know that you specifically said this, but I'm curious the role of punk rock and the culture of punk in terms of that aspect of yourself.
That's a good question. Punk has you questioning the official story, whatever that means. And it can also have you ideally looking out for the people who have fallen down in the pit. And I mean that literally, and I mean that figuratively. And growing up in New York, you begin to realize that, yes, there's a lot of very angry people, and some of those people are of a certain color, but there's angry people of every color. It's a gorgeous mosaic of rage, that city, especially when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. And you just start to realize that there are a million factors that have affected people's progress over the years. And, without punk rock, I don't start reading Maximum Rock and Roll. Without reading Maximum Rock and Roll, I don't discover Noam Chomsky. I never hear of Howard Zinn. Or if I do, I don't until like later in college. And I don't take everything that Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn take as religious. I don't think it's sacred, but I'm awfully glad I was exposed to those ideas through punk and through the culture surrounding ska and reggae too, which is obviously going to be much more diverse than punk rock was, much more diverse than hardcore was, certainly. It's very hard to stay an asshole if you grew up in Manhattan and you're paying attention. You're going to hear from everybody, and if you're really listening, you'll realize that everyone's just kind of trying to do their best. And the whole racism thing with me comes from being told at a very early age that I did not get into a very elite school because of racial quotas in 1976. And even though I knew in my heart, having taken the test to get into that school, that I had shit the bed. I had done horribly on that test. When you failed a test, and I was like, I'm failing. I am 5 and I am failing this test. I shouldn't be tested right now at all. I am 5, but I am a nervous wreck right now, and this is not going well. And my parents were like, well, got to let in a certain amount of black people, which is a terrible thing to tell a 5-year-old, and probably not true. And just a complete skewering of facts, and it fucked me up for a few years there,
Yeah.
And then my dad was kind of old and right wing, and he was born in 1937, and not an enlightened baby boomer. He was, before that. And he had his ideas, and I think every boy wants to impress his dad to a certain extent. So I would have parroted his ethnic jokes and shit like that. And I remember being at a party with some of my ska friends and telling a joke, and I'm grateful I don't remember what the joke was. And they were like, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. And I was like, yeah, no, you're right. I shouldn't do that, should I? Yeah, that's dumb. And it's actually not even that funny, is it? Huh. And so, yeah, I can credit punk and ska with a lot of eye-opening stuff.
Now, I think if I recall, like you described, what appealed to punk rock to you was kind of the volume and the sort of punch in the face it felt like. Would you say that's accurate? That it was more of the sonic experience of punk was sort of the initial what got you into it.
Well, I was such an angry and scared kid, and none of the music I was listening to sounded like what was going on inside my head. Even metal didn't really, because metal was so polished. I'm at the beginning of like Maiden are established and Metallica are on their way up, and these are guys who are incredible musicians. So yeah, it's loud, but it's also so precise and technically proficient that while I enjoy it, it isn't necessarily speaking to me. And again, I don't think I want to go up there and do that. I don't want to emulate that. I'll listen to it, and I'm very fond of the Metallica and Maiden and a lot of metal bands. But there was something about the gleeful, loud amateurishness and the anger that came with punk rock that really spoke to me. And I was like, oh, this sounds like what's going on inside my head. And that's creating me that's giving me a sort of a sense of balance within the force.
The culture of punk, though, that's like sort of something that follows. You get into punk, and then you kind of learn about the culture, and the culture kind of has an impact on you. Does that feel accurate for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what the culture did for me was it showed me that the line between performer and audience is pretty porous, and that years later gave me the courage to be like, well, then, if someone can stick a mic into the audience so we can all sing along, what is to stop me from eventually getting up on stage myself? And that led to Egghead, and Egghead led to acting. So yeah, I honestly, not to put too much significance on it, I really don't think I pursue the job I have had I not picked up that first Ramones record.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other thing about the Ramones specifically was they were, hometown heroes. So you would see Joey walking around, and you could stop him, and he would say hello to you, and he wouldn't shake your hand because of the OCD, but he would be very gracious. He would be very fucking gracious and sweet, and he was quite literally a foot taller than me. So it had to look like I was something he had wiped off his chin, but there was an accessibility to punk rock that my friends who were really into what have you, Duran Duran, Madonna, all these other people who were surrounded by bodyguards, they just would never know that. Like, okay, we both went to see bands over the weekend, but I hung out in the band's van afterwards.
The Ramones actually weren't like in their even in the 80s and 90s, they weren't like necessarily like a gigantic band. They were still playing.
No, they weren't.
Yeah,
they weren't. No, especially not in the States. They would play in the 90s. They started to play really enormous venues in South America. There's all that footage of them doing like soccer stadiums down there. They never got huge in the States, and they were a club act.
Yeah.
In New York, they were a big club act, but they were a club act.
Yeah, so that makes a big difference in terms of like accessibility, like you're saying, and sort of your view of them in terms of rock stars.
Yeah, it's just a simple question of economics. It really is. Like, there are less people crowding this guy, therefore he is able to give his attention to the weird guy with braces who just stopped him. So yeah, it's a real supply demand situation.
Now, Chris Gethard posted that when he posted about your book, he said that you were a mentor to him and that you taught him how to transition pop punk upbringing to the comedy sphere. I'd love to get your take on that.
Oh wow. I think Chris had a lot of it figured out. He's very gracious. He calls me a mentor a lot, and I think it's very kind. But I think Chris would have been okay. I think Chris was going to land on his feet no matter what. But what we had in common was he'd actually seen my band. He had actually seen Egghead.
Uh-huh.
And we talked about that when he started taking classes. There's another story about him getting into the UCB community, Upright Citizens Brigade, when I was working at the office. He called up one time. Yeah, I'll tell this story. He called up one time, and he was like, I want to take a level 1 class, and I can start this Saturday. And I was like, we're booked solid this Saturday. Our next level 1 improv class starts in September. And Chris goes, oh, that's rough. I go back to school. I'm at Rutgers. I'm a student at Rutgers. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you, man. We don't have new classes that open until September. He goes, all right, well, maybe do you think a weekend class might open? I was like, it might open. I don't know, man. Call us back. And he goes, oh, hey, by the way, is this the John Bowie who used to be an Egghead? I was like, am I being punked right now? What the fuck is happening? Who is this prank caller? And I said, yeah. Yeah, I used to see you guys in Jersey. You guys used to play like the youth center in Summit and Berkeley Heights. I'm like, yeah, that was us. That's crazy. And I thought, like, what I'm doing is probably unethical, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I crammed him in to a class that started that Saturday, and he became one of the rising stars at UCB.
Oh.
But he had that kind of make your own opportunities, let's DIY this shit spirit running through him anyway. So yes, I finagled a couple things to make him the 19th person in an 18-person class. I owe that teacher an apology now that I think of it.
So that when he says mentor, he means you bended the rules for him.
Yeah. I did something shady. But Yeah, it was he was a real asset. One of the reasons I let an Egghead fan in was because, like, look, if he's an Egghead fan, he's obviously got a good sense of humor. We had no fans who didn't have a sense of humor. No Egghead fan takes themselves too seriously. I think this could be a real asset. If he'd been like, "Oh yeah, are you really into Venom?" I'd be like, "Yeah, try again in September, buddy." But he was an Egghead fan, and that mattered to me. And I think it made for a good. I think history has borne me out on that. He's done amazing work.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about Upright Citizens Brigade. You worked there in the office. You also, participated in the classes and whatnot. This is kind of where you got your transition into improv and comedy. You talk about how you kind of make some comparisons in the book to punk rock and improv in that it sort of breaks down the walls, the audience to performer walls.
Mm-hmm.
But another interesting thing that caught my attention was that you said that when you went there and you started becoming friends with people in this scene, everyone was just really open about their mental illnesses and everything wrong with them was just casual conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was coming into punk rock in the 1980s, I had close friends there, but there was still a lot of them were very much Mike from Suicidal Tendencies. Don't worry about it, Mom. I'll figure it out myself. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And no one was talking about their problems in any real way, in any really open way. And that wasn't just a punk rock problem. That was a societal problem at large. But I had just started antidepressants when I started taking improv classes, and I blurted out in a scene, or no, not even a scene, in a monologue, in a personal monologue that that was a true story that I was telling to inspire scenes. I mentioned that I was on Zoloft, and after class, somebody came up to me and was like, "Oh, how's that working out for you, man?" Because I'm hit or miss on Prozac, and I was like, "Oh my god, we're just talking about this shit now. We're just like we just get to say this stuff to each other," and it was remarkable how many people were trying to work through some mental health issues in comedy, and how open people were about it. And I found that very soothing, very needed, and very soothing.
Yeah. I've found that, friends of mine that are comedians or whatever, so comfortable. They're just so comfortable talking about the darkest parts of their personality. And it's just like you're just talking about sports or something, or you're just talking about the weather even.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Um, I feel like, and again, this is also a societal thing at large.
Yeah.
I think generally people are getting more comfortable talking about it, but I think comedy was a forerunner because so much of it has to be about vulnerability, and talking about your own shortcomings is usually a great way to start. Or not even shortcomings, your issues, the stuff that is on your mind, is a great way to start defining your comedic voice. And for me, being super candid about clinical depression was was ironically a way to get funnier.
Yeah, because I think like with punk rock and like there's room for misfits. I think there's definitely an inclusivity element where it's like you don't fit in, you're welcome here. But yeah, I don't know that they're necessarily super open about talking about everything at the same time. Just to make a generalization.
Yeah, it's again, I'm not going to shows with teenagers. The people I meet, the middle-aged punks that I meet who are still going to shows are pretty fucking candid about, because all of them are either deep in the thick of addiction or
Right.
sober, because there's kind of no halfway point in punk rock. So you're certainly going to talk a lot about people's sobriety. I think generally speaking, we as a whole have moved towards a broader discussion, certainly broader than it was when I started taking Paxil in 1998.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we'll cut to the future. You got on Big Bang Theory. You become a working actor. You make a comment in your book about how people might not think this is punk rock, but anything that fills you with serotonin and adrenaline is. I would love to hear a little bit more about what you meant by that.
What I mean is that I got here doing, and the section of the book you're referring to mentions the fact that, yeah, it's pretty establishment to be on a massive hit Warner Brothers show. And I accept that. And there are some purists who would likely call me a sellout. What punk rock told me is to maybe not give too much of a shit what other people think, but also to really find your joy, and find the thing that you're good at and do that. And the jump from punk rock to comedy was so logical to me that this does feel like a natural extension. It doesn't feel like there's been some massive compromise. I feel like I was compromising my principles so much more when I was working in corporate America in my 20s and working for all sorts of nefarious companies in management consulting or engineering or pharmaceuticals or what have you. Companies that were up to God knows what kind of malfeasance, companies that were literally being investigated by the Justice Department while I was temping there, trying to earn money to support my punk band. I feel a lot more at peace with the work I do for a living now than I did in my 20s. And it's fun, and I think it's where I to put it back into corporate terms, I think it's where I add value. I entertain people. That's something I seem to do.
Mm-hmm.
It would be great if I was better with numbers, but I'm not. So monkey dance.
Thank you so much for listening to In Defense of Ska. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you normally stream or download episodes. If you haven't already, grab a copy of my book, In Defense of Ska, available at clashbooks.com. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. It's at In Defense of Ska. And please consider joining our Patreon at patreon.com/In Defense of Ska. You will get monthly bonus episodes, extended interviews and commentary per episode, and access to the In Defense of Ska Discord. In Defense of Ska would not be possible without the great team that tirelessly works on it every week. So you should go check out their other projects as well. Co-host Adam Davis has an amazing band called Omnigon. Give them a follow on Instagram and Twitter. It's simply @Omnigon. And our editor, Chris Reeves, has a phenomenal record label and podcast called Ska Punk International. For more information, go to skapunkinternational.com. And if you've ever enjoyed one of the highly specific In Defense of Ska memes floating around the interwebs, it was likely the work of The Bands I Like Only Charge $18. Find them on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On that note, we leave you by saying, Ska now more than ever.
What was your favorite moment of the episode?
I don't know, probably just hearing John's voice like in real time, because I listened to the audiobook, and then just getting to hear him talk to me was pretty nice. I feel like we made a good connection.
Yeah, he was like, "Hey, Adam Davis, I really enjoy talking to you specifically. You're a great co-host."
This other guy, though, I don't know. He didn't say that.
No, he didn't say that, but he thought it.
Yeah.
Now, we talked to John a little longer. Once we ended this episode, we said, this episode is no more. We said, just a second, this episode is a little bit more, but only for those who have $5.
So head over to the Patreon, sign up for the Patreon. Or if you already have Patreon, then you're all set. Go listen to the other bit of this conversation.
We talked about we didn't really talk too much about his band Egghead during the episode, but we did talk about
how his band Egghead recorded the song in 95 called Neighborhood Palm Reader, and then they finally made a video for it in 2022.
You get
It's
to hear
pretty
about
funny,
how
yeah.
that came together.
Yes, and all the little details behind the scene. Just fascinating.
That's what you need in your life right now.
So tune in next week. We talk to Tim and Mike of Supernova, the greatest ska festival this side of the Mississippi.
This side of
Technically, it's
Mississippi?
actually- yeah,
I think we're on
technically
the
it's the
opposite
other side. Yeah, whatever. Either side of the Mississippi.
Yeah, on either side of the Mississippi.